There's a good reason that the Mazzer Philos is one of the most anticipated home grinders this year. But what does it do better than other grinders that are almost all cheaper? And why is this becoming one of my favorite grinders to use every day? Just a quick note, this video isn't sponsored by anybody, but if you find my videos helpful, you can support this channel by getting my new book, The Brew Ledger. This book aims to help you dial in faster and save your favorite espresso recipes in this beautiful A5 hardcover book. I've just received the first copies and will be launching a Kickstarter soon, so click the link in the description below to find out more, and thank you so much for supporting this channel. First, the Philos is beautiful and the build is one of the best I've ever seen. The body is made of steel, brass and anodized aluminium with only a few plastic but still very solid components. This makes the Philos a little heavier than most grinders at 12.5 kilos, and it's a little bit larger than most too. To compare, this is it next to some of the other grinders I've reviewed or will be doing reviews of soon. You put your beans in the top funnel here, and this is where the first good trade-off that this grinder has is introduced. This grinder is one of the slower grinders I own, despite being 1400 RPM. That's because the beans go into the funnel and down into the auger or pre-breaker, which is a rotary fin that pre-cracks the beans as they're fed towards the 64mm flat burrs in here. This stepped braking system slows things down, where some other grinders fully brute force or gravity feed the beans through the burrs. That speed on other grinders can lead to coffee grinds being compacted, as they're literally pushed through the grinder burr chamber by the beans behind them, giving you clumps. With the Philos, these beans are broken up and fed through at a more even pace, which makes these grinds come out super fluffy. My average espresso grind on setting 20 took around 16 seconds, but look at those yummy grinds. And that's without something like a declumper, because frankly it doesn't need it. The motor has plenty of torque as well, and while I usually do a hot start with the motor running, because it just looks so satisfying, I can put 18 grams in for a shot on this grinder while it's off, and it'll just grind away without stalling. The most important component though, of course, is the burrs. The Philos has two to choose from, the multi-purpose i200D burrs or the traditional espresso focused i189D burrs. I tried both of them for the last few months, and I honestly found them both to be good for different styles of coffee. The i200D burrs are supposed to emphasize clarity, and they've been designed in-house by Mazzer. But in my experience, the flavors coming from this style of multi-purpose burr were not very exciting. You lose a lot of texture, and in my opinion, the flavors with the dozens of coffees I tried were a bit muddled, maybe silty like the experience you get with that last bit of a French press that's been a little over-extracted. A strong flavor, but not anywhere near as pleasant as the 189D burrs. These burrs are some of my favorites yet. They had a really sparky and rich flavor profile with great texture, and for me it found a near perfect middle ground between clarity and mouthfeel. As you can see in this comparison, the architecture looks very similar to the high uniformity SSP burrs that I've just put in my DF83V, and based on this test with the D-Fluid Omni, you can see that they produce a distribution that's quite focused, but with a little extra fines and courses that lend some extra texture. Using a particle analyzer like this one isn't perfect accuracy, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that certain particle distributions aren't necessarily better or worse, but you can clearly see here that in my tests, the 200D burrs distribution is a little flatter than the 189D burrs. Burr design is a very complicated subject, and I'm no expert. But I found that the shape of the grooves has one of the biggest impacts on flavor of any part of your coffee setup. Different lines encourage the beans to grind into different shapes and sizes, and these burrs just make really lovely quality espresso. They offer a sweetness and velvety mouthfeel that's just fantastic. I can't fault either of these burr sets, but I can recommend the 189D for medium light roast and a great balance between mouthfeel and clarity, and while I wasn't blown away by the multi-purpose 200D burrs, I'm sure people who like filter coffee will enjoy them. I don't really do filter coffee, so maybe better to check out someone else's Philos video if that's what you mostly brew. One of the best things about this grinder is that the workflow is one of the most comfortable and satisfying of any grinder I've used. Everything is very smooth, clicky, snappy, and satisfying. People don't really talk enough about how important it is to have fun and have that artisanal experience when using your coffee gear, and this is all so satisfying. A good example is the knocker here. Unlike the Time War Sculptor series I reviewed, which has a rotary knocker that needed at least 8 or 10 clicks to get all the grinds out, This one has enough momentum that no more coffee is coming out after just 2 snaps most of the time. So it doesn't add a frustrating or uncomfortable movement to every grind. Now, a lot of grinders claim to have 0 retention, and I think this is something of a misnomer. You can have minimal retention, but 0 is basically impossible. I can't even get 0 retention from the dosing cup to the portafilter most of the time. What I think Mazzer has done quite well here is to give you options that allow you to get closer to 0 if you want to put in some extra effort. With only the knocker, I'm getting rid of a lot of the coffee inside the chute, which is great. But then we can use this little cylinder that they call the shot finisher. It goes into the funnel, and then you give it a little wiggle, and that gets more of the remaining grinds inside the chamber out. This can dislodge almost all of the coffee stuck in the chute because it goes all the way to the edges and pushes the grinds back up into the burr chamber, where the spinning burrs can then push it back down into the catcher. Now, the shot finisher is a lot of faff. Even taking off this front face plate to get this out feels like a bit of a workflow breaker for me, but to be honest, I rarely feel the need to use it. Yes, it does get a little bit of extra coffee grinds out, maybe 0.2 grams or so on the average single dose grind, but I only really use it for expensive coffee beans when I really want to prevent waste. Next, the dosing cup is one of the best I've used in a grinder so far. The walls are very thin while still feeling premium and sturdy, so if you want to stick it in a 58mm portafilter and flip it upside down, you'll have a minimal ring around the edge. They also do an optional extra of a 53mm dosing cup as well. It holds around 50 grams at full, and since it's made of metal, it has something that I love in coffee gear. You already know what it is. Magnets. And this is just one of the most satisfying implementations I've seen of this so far. And the grind adjustment has a broad range, and I found it to be one of the easiest to dial in of any of the grinders I've used over the years. It's stepped by default, and at first I was happy to stick with that for the standard medium roast espressos, as the steps are nicely spaced at a reported 6 microns. Rather than having all your espressos in a narrow range like you might have with some other grinders, the steps here feel very far apart because of the big size of the adjustment ring. For example, I roasted a Brazilian coffee quite dark for my Saturday morning latte art practice, and I was grinding at around 26, but for this beautiful light side of medium Tanzanian bean I just started roasting, I have it all the way down at around 13. That's a big range, and plenty of room at the bottom for any unusual beans that might need to go finer than any of the dozens of different beans I've ground with it. I did start to find that I wanted some half steps when using much lighter filter style roasts, and stepless is just better anyway. Luckily, the stepless adjustment is super easy to do. All you need to do is take off the back plate with a screwdriver, take out these 3 little pins with something small, I used an Allen key, and then pop it back on and realign the 0 point. Now, a lot of people have asked me how I feel about the adjustment ring being on the back of the grinder. Personally, I don't find this particularly offensive because my space is wide and open and I'm freakishly tall, but I get that it's not great for everybody. If you have a countertop with low cupboards, you might find this a little bit annoying, and if you're not 6'2" like me, you might find it harder to read what's on the adjustment ring. I have a silver one, and as much as I love the look, under certain light, it can be a little harder to read the setting at first glance, especially if I've got my big studio light on. This might be a deal breaker for some, especially as a lot of grinders have the adjustment more easily visible on the front, which does make more sense as it's the thing you'll be using the most. Like I said, it's not a big deal for me, but it might disrupt your workflow a little depending on your setup. As for the noise while grinding, this isn't a quiet grinder, but thankfully it's not like some other grinders I've tested that have irritating or squeaky grinding noises. The Philos has vibration dampening components all throughout the body, so you end up with a very comfortable, low-pitched sound that doesn't ring too hard on the ears. So let's open this up. A quick note, my contact at Mazzer told me that the design of the chamber should reduce moisture buildup and prevent mold or rust, which will improve the longevity of this grinder over multiple burr replacements. Now, of course, you are going to need to change the burrs, whether you're switching out to different ones or just replacing worn-out blades, and it is, as always, a bit of a pain in the ass. But changing burrs on the Philos was one of the hardest grinders I've had to do this with. To change the burrs, you need to pull off the front, which is very easy with those thumb screws, and here's where I had the issue. Mine came factory installed with the multi-purpose 200D burrs, but when I tried to take them out and switch to the 189D burrs for testing, I found that the screws were so tight that I almost stripped the heads just trying to get them out. To avoid stripping the screw heads by repeatedly trying to remove the screws, I ended up having to call my brother in to help me. He's an engineer who used to work on coffee machines, and he was able to get the screws out by tapping on the head of the screwdriver to loosen it up a little bit. I did get some replacement screws from Mazzer, and so far those have been fine, but from the factory they were really in there, so I'd suggest being very gentle with removing them so you don't do what I almost did and get your burrs stuck. But one thing that seems to have worked out very well when switching back and forth is that the alignment is basically always perfect without having to fuss around with shims or anything like that. The 0 point will be different for different burrs, but that's very easy to adjust after you put the dial back on, and using the marker test I found that as long as I cleaned the plate where the burrs sit properly before switching, it ended up perfectly aligned every time. On other grinders, I've never had this first time. I've always had to adjust to get perfect alignment, so it's a testament to the fine tolerances in the manufacturing process here. Now, before I stick the front back on, one of the things I think every grinder manufacturer should be doing is pre-seasoning the burrs. Mazzer told me that the grinder burrs don't need any seasoning because they're pre-seasoned in the factory, so no longer is it your responsibility to have worse tasting coffee and higher variance for a few kilos before the burrs trim off their edges. This is an awesome and welcome inclusion with Mazzer's burrs, and this is one of the things that you are paying for when you shell out a little extra for something like the Philos. It is more expensive than many other 64mm grinders on the market right now at a launch price of £730 before tax as I'm recording this. At that price, it has some stiff competition, some of which is actually more feature rich than the Philos. I asked my contact there why some of the more modern home grinder features like variable RPM weren't included, and I was told it's because of their long R&D process and wanting to make sure that everything they did was done right and not just shoehorned in to keep up with the Joneses. And this makes sense. This grinder is made by one of the most experienced grinder manufacturers in the game, and they are showing that they know all of the issues that plague grinders over time, and they built this one to last. So what do I really think about this grinder? First, I want to thank Mazzer for sending this to me for review and agreeing to my condition of not having any control over editorial or even seeing this video before it goes live. And personally, I think this is one of the best built pieces of coffee gear that I have. But is it the best 64mm flat burr grinder? Well, there are definitely others like the Zerno, which I haven't got because their waitlist is very long, that look more impressive. And there are cheaper grinders like the DF64V that have variable speed and are much more affordable. So I'm not going to pretend that there isn't a big difference in price, but more than most other grinders I've used, I'm really enjoying the workflow and comfort of using the Philos. The build quality truly is second to none, and it's a big reliable presence on my coffee table that's quite hard to switch away from. If you're on a budget or you're trying to get the best bang for your buck at this price range or burr size, this isn't that. And that's okay. If you want a really consistent workhorse that's equally good in a small cafe or for a fancy home setup that will just be a delight to use every day, it's an amazing option that shouldn't be underestimated. Now, if you want to see some of the main competitors to this grinder, check out the video on screen now. Thanks so much for watching, you wonderfully overcaffeinated people, and I'll see you on the next one.